All right, well, here we are in Lecture C for this week. Last time, we were talking about deductive and inductive arguments. We learned the terminology valid and strong for those arguments, and we learned some ways in which these arguments, if they're not straightforwardly presented, can go wrong. We learned about implicit premises and implicit conclusions, and the danger that can cause for critical thinking. And we talked about the difference between a description and an explanation, and that this too, usually if you're just giving a description or explanation and you're not actually stating your argument, what you're doing is having an unstated conclusion right there. Yeah? So what we're working on this week, and what we've been trying to work on, is a good solid idea of what it is like, what it looks like to try and present a solid argument. And we're going to start to get into fallacies next week and other ways of judging whether or not arguments are good. And then in week 4, we're going to get into the formal stuff. We're going to talk about actual specific argument types, and this is this kind of inductive argument, and this is how you do that well. And we're also going to learn how to prove deductive arguments using truth tables. All right. But for this lesson, we're going to talk about ambiguity, and we're going to talk about how to make definitions. Those are going to be the two big focuses of this lecture. Okay? All right, well, let's go ahead and do it. Okay, so Dowden splits ambiguity up into syntactic ambiguity and semantic ambiguity. And I do want you to keep these terms in mind. This is helpful for you to remember. Usually, syntactic ambiguity is not the sort of ambiguity that you actually run into when you're having a conversation. So I'm super popular. I spend all of my time on YouTube. You know, people will, of course, write with incorrect grammar now and then, and maybe that will affect their argument. But if I'm being charitable, and if I'm actually trying to think, all right, well, what must they mean, then usually this syntactical, I can get around that, you can get around that. But with semantic ambiguity, that is much harder for even a charitable person to just get around and to understand what you mean. So Dowden's examples are newspaper headlines. Let's take a look at just a couple. Right, so this is a headline here, "More sanctions coming, Japan will." This is the example we have of the syntactic ambiguity. It's syntactically ambiguous because we don't know if Japan is being warned or if Japan is warning someone else. So yeah, if you just saw that headline, you'd be a little confused. I'm not super concerned about this personally. I find myself less concerned about syntactic ambiguity than Dowden is concerned with it. Because if you were really confused, which, you know, we don't know what this headline is saying, well, you could open the paper and read and find out pretty quickly. Also, with this sort of thing, I mean, if you're following news at all, you would probably have an idea of the context. So I myself am a little less concerned with that syntactic ambiguity than Dowden is. But I am more concerned with the semantic ambiguity. And again, his example is a newspaper headline, and it's a little, you know, it's a little contrite here. Oh, contrite's not the word. Trite. And it's a little almost silly. Air Force considers dropping some new bombs. Yeah, so the problem here is what? Why is this ambiguous? So it's ambiguous because this dropping, we don't know if they mean dropping in a bombing sense, like you would do in a war, or dropping as in discontinuing. So certainly That's a semantic definition, but frankly, that's also a little silly because you could just read the newspaper and figure that out. Here's something, though, that I find. So I teach political philosophy. That's my area of interest and expertise. And people often use rights language without any care or understanding for what a right is. Usually people just use a right to mean, well, this is the way it should be. But they're usually not using it in a very precise way. So, for example, this is an example that I like to use in class. When we start talking about rights, I'll say, okay, do you think you have the right to marry anyone you want? And people will say, of course we do, right? So then I'll ask, well, do you have the right to marry me? And that's a little silly. I'm already married, as a matter of fact, so you might think you don't have the right to marry me. Having a right actually implies that everyone else has a duty to let you do that thing. So if I really do have a right to marry, I don't know, Johnny Depp, just the first celebrity name that came to my mind, that means even Johnny Depp has to let me marry him. So actually, I don't have that right. If the other person consents, of course, then you do have the right. But that would be an example of semantic ambiguity, and it does come up in philosophy, and it does come up in some areas where the slight difference of meaning in a word can have entirely different implications for what the conclusion would be. And here's another one that I find interesting. So when I teach political philosophy, I often use the term liberal and liberalism, liberal democratic philosophers. And this term in political philosophy does not refer to Democrats and Republicans. It refers to the idea that all humans are created equal and have equal moral status, and that any government coercion needs to be justified to the coerced individuals. So liberalism is a type of looking at government in a type of way of justifying government, and that's not what most people think. So I would be ambiguous if I told you I was a liberal philosopher without also explaining that, hey, I'm using this term in a very specific way. Alright, so how do you fix this? The idea is, as much as possible, define your terms and explain to the reader how you intend to argue. So back in lecture A, I spent a slide on each of our authors that we read, Singer, Van Parijs, and Miller. I spent a slide discussing the opening because I wanted you to see and pay attention to how the authors create the context for their argument. And doing that helps limit the amount of ambiguity. So refer back to those, but today we're going to talk about defining your terms, because if I tell you we're all liberals in America, you may disagree with me. You may think, well, plenty of people are libertarian, plenty of people are conservative, etc., etc. So I need to define my term for you. I need to tell you what I mean. So that's what we're going to do. All right, let's move forward. So here's a bit about context and background knowledge. Dowden brings up this term, disambiguate, an otherwise ambiguous word or sentence. Right, and this is what we just explained. One way that you can disambiguate your meaning is by providing context. So that's why I'm not super concerned about this ambiguous title type stuff, because you can disambiguate it by reading the article. It's pretty easy to disambiguate these sorts of things. Yeah, it's kind of silly. It's, you should try to be clear, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Okay, and the other way we're going to disambiguate is by giving our definitions. Okay, so again, I refer you back to Peter Singer, Philippe Van Parijs, and David Miller, the authors for the other articles that we talked about this week, for examples of how to provide context for what you're talking about. Okay. Disambiguation by machine and semantic disagreements. So it's important for you to at least be aware that your brain is constantly working to contextualize, to disambiguate, to make sense of my sentences, my words, and anything I use. And so this was an interesting example, the disambiguation by machine of translation errors, right? So his example was weak in the flesh. Here we go. His example was, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You translate that into Russian using this machine, and you translate it back, and you get, the vodka is strong, but the meat is rotten. I don't know if you guys got this too, but when I read that, I at first thought, wow, that's such a Russian phrase. You know, vodka is strong, but the meat is rotten. So I thought that was a very creative instance here. Now I want to use this phrase because it actually makes sense to me. But it does mean something pretty different from the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And that's because a computer, at least at this time in the 1950s, they're getting better and better. But for the most part today, computers also have this problem of not being able to contextualize our words. So everything I'm saying has a very specific semantic meaning, the literal meaning of my words. And in our general speech anyway, we're usually not super careful about the semantic meanings. You can understand what I mean anyway, just because you're my friend and you've been living with me for quite a while, so you understand how I think and what I'm going after. So it's not a big deal if I say something that is literally untrue, because you get my meaning. But when we're writing an argument, it all comes down to semantics and the literal meanings, and as much as possible, we want to avoid relying on people's automatic, unconscious contextualization. So make it clear. You can say, look, the common definition for the word, let's see, what were his examples? Right here. The common definition for the word inconsistent usually means flip-flopping on an idea, but in our class, we're going to use it to refer to holding a logical contradiction. So if I decide that today I like apples and tomorrow I like pineapple, I'm not being inconsistent in our classroom terms, right? And you know this now because I've told you, I've made it explicit. So we're going to do that in our papers and in our arguments too. We're going to try and make everything explicit. All right. So that was just a very interesting example here. Now, semantic disagreements are funny and awful at the same time because you can spend so much energy arguing with someone about a topic only to find out you're talking past each other. So for this, what let's do, let's look at the homework. Let's look at this one. Let's do this question right here. You know what? I wanted to do the Emilio Juanita. Here we go. So explain why the following passage contains a semantic disagreement rather than a substantial one. Well, Emilio's talking about Andre, and apparently Andre is really pro-American foreign policy. Andre always flies the American flag. He supports and defends America. So Emilio is saying Andre is pretty American. And then Juanita is saying, but he's a citizen of Argentina. He's not a real American. Given the current political climate, I feel that we could imagine people having discussions about what it means to be American. And quite often, I think we do see that semantic disagreement where, to my eyes anyway, it seems like some will talk about what it means to be American, quote-unquote, culturally, in spirit, whereas others will take that term to mean simply citizenship. So, if you're having a conversation with someone then, it's important to define what we're talking about as an American citizen. Now maybe you might think being a citizen isn't enough to be, quote, American, unquote, but in that case we can go ahead and have an argument about that and not waste our time having an argument here where we're never going to see eye to eye because we're using different terms, different ideas. Okay? Moral of this story is always to just be explicit with absolutely everything. So what we talked about earlier was laying out our premises explicitly and laying out our conclusion explicitly. And now what we're talking about is laying out our definitions, telling our audience what we mean by our terms explicitly, giving the audience the context of the discussion that we want to be having, explicitly laying it out. So those are the takeaways. That's what we're working with. So what I want to work on now is definitions. I want you to learn these three terms: ostensive, lexical, and stipulative definition. So the ostensive definition is going to be when you point at something and say, there, that is a token of that kind. What is a dog? Well, here's an example right here. I happen to have a dog in my room. I point at it. Then I'm giving you an ostensive definition. What I'm doing right now, right? I'm giving you examples of ostensive definitions. That itself is giving an ostensive definition of an ostensive definition. And right now I'm giving another extensive definition. Anyway, it will never stop. So the lexical definition is just going to be the dictionary definition. It's an agreed upon, and here's the key idea, it's a general definition, right? It's agreed upon and general. Now, in philosophy, we try to avoid using dictionary definitions for our terms because usually we're trying to get to something very specific and very unique, and we're trying to create and define new and more refined concepts. And a lexical dictionary definition is not going to contain all of the nuances that we might have in a specific philosophy field. So, for example, you might get, regarding inconsistent, you might get an example, a definition that says something about changing one's mind or not always acting in the same way. You may not get a dictionary definition that tells you that inconsistency is holding logical contradictions. But for our purposes, that's what it is. So a lexical definition is going to be very helpful for a place to start. If in your paper you're writing about animal welfare and perhaps you're concerned about whether or not animals qualify as persons, okay, well maybe you can start with the lexical definition of a person and then ask yourself whether or not that fits with the idea you have in mind. And then you can stipulate the idea that you have in mind, right? So a stipulative definition is a definition that the speaker creates. It's for the purpose of defining a topic, to highlight one aspect of that topic, or to create a new concept. So what we've done here, we have stipulated these definitions. I'm telling you, I'm stipulating to you, this is what I mean by inconsistent. It refers to holding a logical contradiction. This is what I mean by some. It refers to some and possibly all. I'm going to pause while we wait for that siren to die down. Okay? So, if you're going to write about, let's see, universal basic income, a lot of that entire article was the author stipulating definitions for what he means by cash income, for what he means by universal, and then explaining what happens from there. If you write in response and maybe you're concerned that universal basic income doesn't respect what people deserve, you might need to give a stipulative definition about how you know when a person deserves something or doesn't. Okay? So in general, it's helpful to give a stipulative definition and then follow it up with an ostensive definition. So that's also what I ask you to do in our homework. For an example, I ask you to give a stipulative and ostensive definition for the concept of racism. So what that means is you're going to stipulate this is what it is and give me a general description, an abstract description of what that is, and then give me an example of what that is, okay? Now, I'm not asking for a lexical definition, right? So this is your chance to tell me what this word means according to your understanding. And I can imagine that some of you are asking now, well, geez, if that's all philosophy is, stipulating definitions, then everyone's just going to have their own definition of what racism means. We're never going to come to an understanding. Well, yeah, that could be the case if we never read each other's work. But the idea with stipulating a definition like this is that you can give me the definition and I can disagree. And I can point out other cases of racism and say, look, your definition doesn't fit this case. So then we're going to modify our definition together. So philosophy and critical thinking not only involves a search for truth as it is, but it involves a search for a more refined and more descriptive concepts. And this is how we change our definitions, by stipulating it, and then by seeing if that stipulated definition fits our known examples, and by experimenting with how changes to that definition will affect how we view the item, in this case racism, in the real world. Okay? So as long as we're here, let's go ahead and just quickly say what I want you to do regarding 9 and 10. So suppose you tell me racism is when X, Y, and Z happens. So using that definition, say something true about all instances of racism. So if X, Y, and Z happens, if racism happens, then what? Tell me something that will be true for all cases of racism. And then here, you can use your definition to say something that is true only about some instances of racism. So because racism is X, Y, and Z, then when L occurs, it might also be a case of racism, but L need not occur in every case for it to happen as racism. Okay? Alright, hopefully that makes sense. If not, then go ahead and post something to the Week 2 forum. Alright, let's get back to it. We're running on time here. Okay, so definitions can have some problems. They can be too broad or too narrow. They can be ambiguous themselves, and they can be circular. These are just some general issues to look out for. So a broad definition is one that is going to include too many examples, things that aren't really that item that we already kind of know. So let's take an example here. Okay, so what I've done here is just created two definitions for the concept of art. You might define it as anything that is pretty to look at, or you might define it as an oil painting on canvas. And my suggestion is that this top definition is too broad and this bottom definition is too narrow. Well, what does that mean? So if this top definition is too broad, then that means that there are some things that will fit this definition, some things that are pretty to look at, but that are not actually art, that we already understand not to be art. So what might that be? Well, here I just looked up some examples of driftwood. Now maybe this one here, we would call this artwork. But would we call this artwork, or even this? I'm not sure that this guy right here, I don't think that's art. Right? I'm not alone in thinking that, but I could still think that that's pretty to look at. Or a person could be pretty to look at, but it would be weird to say that a person is art. So that doesn't seem like a very helpful definition. It's too broad. Or I might say that art is an oil painting on canvas. Well, pretty much all oil paintings on canvas are art, right? Or could qualify as art. Maybe bad art, but art nonetheless. But certainly not all art is oil paintings on canvas. This one, for example, I feel pretty comfortable saying that this is artwork, but it's not an oil painting on canvas. Okay, so for fun, here's my definition of art that I think is not too broad, not too narrow, but just right. Okay, so here's my example. Art is an item that is held up for aesthetic evaluation and appreciation. So for me, then, I'm saying art is essentially anything that you'll find in a museum. Art is anything that we hold up and we examine it and scrutinize it for its aesthetic value. But I imagine that someone of you probably have an issue with that definition. So if that's the case, then why? Think about why this definition doesn't fit for you. Is it that it's too broad or too narrow? Or is it that it doesn't hit on the main concept? Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to go into. But how about circularity? So I'm going to skip ambiguity because we've already talked about it. You can have syntactic and semantic ambiguity. And if you've got either of those ambiguities going on in your definitions, this part of the definition, then you're not going to have a very helpful definition. So how about circularity? What if I say art is anything made by an artist? Well, okay, that's probably true, but that's actually a circular definition, because how do we define an artist? We define an artist as someone who makes art. So a circular definition is going to either involve two definitions or imply a second definition. Maybe this one here is circular because I talk about aesthetic evaluation. I'm not sure I have a good understanding of what this word means in a way that is separate from art. I don't know. I'd go into it and think about it. But then I'm not a philosopher of art, so I'm not super concerned about my artistic definitions. But here's one thing I do want to point out. If I make a claim to you and you disagree, well, that's okay. That's just me saying I like pistachio ice cream. I say pistachio ice cream is delicious. And you say, no, it's not. Well, okay. At that point, we're even, right? I said yes, you said no. But if I start to give you reasons, and if I provide an argument, the burden of proof is on you to tell me why my reasons are unpersuasive. So when you read either your animal ethics, immigration restriction, or economic distribution, all of those authors were giving you reasons for their conclusion. So if you read Singer and you still want to eat meat, or you still think that animal experimentation is okay, then the burden is on you to explain why you're not convinced by his argument. And as a critical thinker, we are not going to accept, well, because I don't like it. So which of these claims, I'm just going to do these ones down here, which of these claims do you think requires the stronger burden of proof? Says that pain is worthy of moral consideration, that animals feel pain, and that if pain is worthy of moral consideration, and if animals feel pain, then animals are worthy of moral consideration. Which one of these requires the strongest burden of proof, do you think? I don't think it's this one. This makes pretty intuitive sense to me, that if we shouldn't cause things pain, and if animals are things that feel pain, that's a pretty strong argument then that you shouldn't cause them pain, more or less, right? How about this one? Pain is worthy of moral consideration. Do you need any good reasons for believing in that? I actually have a philosopher friend who thinks you do need better reasons, but for myself, I just rely on my experience. Like, I've experienced pain, so I take that to be a pretty common understanding here. I don't know that Singer needs to provide me with any extra explanation. But this one is usually pretty controversial for people, that animals are able to suffer as much or in a similar way to humans. So Singer needs to do some explanation, give us some reason for believing that this one's the case. All right, we're getting close here toward the end, just a couple more. This is one last thing here. So we've talked about ambiguity, and that can muddy up your meaning, but here since it was also in our text at that time, I wanted to point it out. Another way in which you can muddy your meaning, and this is a little more mischievous, is to divert someone's attention to something else. So this is the famous red herring fallacy. So here I just give a few examples. For myself, I see this in politics all the time. On both sides, everyone seems to do it. But when a person is criticized for their recent actions, they'll turn it around and ask, well, you didn't complain about this when it was happening before, or you didn't, or what about this other person you like? He did this. So for the case of Trump, they'll sometimes ask, I was thinking of the, oh gosh, I can't remember now. Yeah. So, I mean, it may be the case that we, the audience, are not being... So it may be the case that Trump's audience is holding... It may be the case that Trump's audience is holding him to a higher standard than Obama, but that is not... but that does not detract from any criticisms that a person could give of Trump. The fact that I'm criticizing your behavior and not someone else's behavior doesn't mean that my criticisms aren't valid. It means that maybe if I was to be more consistent, I would criticize someone else. Sure, but that's not the issue if I'm criticizing you for your actions, okay? So that would be bringing in a second issue, and this is just something to be aware about, that when we engage in critical thinking, when we engage in argumentation as honest intellectual thinkers, we need to deal with conclusions one at a time. And it's no good to bring in a second argument before the first argument has concluded. So be aware of this. I'm going to be watching out if this happens in your responses to any of our other readings. Let's see, anything else here? So yeah, the general takeaway here is just like it has always been. Look for conclusions, identify your own conclusions, identify the conclusions of the person giving you an argument, and don't move away from that conclusion until you have it settled. Or, sometimes you can't solve everything all at once, but then be explicit and say, okay, we're going to put that aside. Let's talk about a different argument for now. Okay? All right. And I think we're going to cut it here. I've already gotten pretty long. I think we're up to half an hour. I don't want to get it any longer. So I think we've covered everything you're going to need to know in order to do our homework. If not, if you have any other issues, as always, let someone know. Okay. I'll see you guys next week.